Hello everybody, my name is Gabrielle Lapointe, and this is my presentation on Velma Page and her story as a residential school survivor. So a little bit about Velma. She was born and raised on the Nanu's First Nation Reserve in British Columbia. This is where Velma spent the better part of her adult life, while also spending time living in Comox, Deep Bay, and Duncan, BC. Velma attended Cooper Island Residential School from 1948 to 1952. She was only 6 years old when she and her youngest sister were taken and then later separated. Velma mentions in the interview that she only remembers attending Cooper Island from 1950 to 1952, noting that her memory became stronger after the passing of her mother in 1950. And she only learned that she attended school previously by her paperwork. Velma's assigned number at residential school was number 42. She recollects that faculty and staff mostly referred to her by this number, and she was rarely called by her real name. 6 of Velma's older siblings attended Cooper Island Residential School before her, although Velma didn't get to know these older siblings because they were already in residential school by the time she could remember, and she didn't come to know what they looked like or had a relationship until she became much older. Velma's best memory of life before residential school is spending time with her mother and feeling happy and safe on the reserve. Both of Velma's parents attended residential schools. She doesn't note which ones, but she does state that they were reluctant to talk about their experience there. Moving forward, I'm going to talk about Velma's experience at Cooper Island Residential School. So Velma recalls that she was very scared and fearful leaving the reserve. Like many kids, she didn't know where she was headed and wasn't able to properly say goodbye to her parents. Going to residential school was Velma's first encounter with any white people, as well as any religious people. When she arrived at Cooper Island, Velma was given strict orders to not look around for any of her siblings or anyone else that she might recognize or know, as they didn't really want Indigenous students to be talking amongst each other. Velma's demeanor was very quiet, obedient, and she always followed the orders given to her. Velma felt very alone in residential school. She had no friends, and this would be an issue that she would struggle with for the rest of her life. Velma developed poor socialization skills, and the fear of punishment made her a very quiet and submissive young girl. The education she received was poor. She mostly learned about the Bible and God and was told to do chores most of her day. Velma notes that the chores she was given was to dust the stairs, clean the dining hall, specifically the nuns' dining hall. She knitted socks for the young men and the priests, and she did laundry. When Velma finally attended public school years later, she was far behind the other students her age, which caused a lot of shame and embarrassment, which furthered the issue she had with making friends. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit more about Velma's experience and note what's similar or maybe different from other people's experiences that we've looked at in readings. So first off, Velma has definitely experienced intergenerational trauma. Velma's relationship with her mother She recalls that her mother didn't show her really much affection at all as a kid, and this is likely a result of some trauma from attending residential schools. Velma's relationship with her older sister. In the interview, she mentions that her sister turned into a bitter woman as a result of her experience at residential school. She never saw her sister show emotion or even cry. She held in a lot of anger, which caused Velma and her to butt heads a lot, and their relationship never really recovered, unfortunately, before her sister passed away. I think she mentioned 8 years ago from the time of the interview. Obviously, this is quite difficult for Velma as she breaks down in the interview, and I'm assuming she feels a lot of regret. Velma's partners, she tells about how she married her first husband at the age of 15, who was also the father of her children. Velma's ex-husband abandoned her and the children in 1972 to go off and start a new life in the United States. She doesn't go into detail about why, but we can assume that it has some connection to attending residential school. And yes, he also attended residential school, and that's likely to contribute to the rocky relationship that they'd endured. Velma mentioned that some of her other partners she was in relationship with were abusive. She felt trapped and compelled to stay with these men, and her decision to stay with them ultimately took a toll on her family, as her children strongly disagreed with her decision, which caused them to leave. Velma's relationship with her children and her grandchildren is still complex. At the time this interview was recorded, she shared that many of her children don't communicate with her, and they don't communicate. She doesn't communicate with her grandchildren either, which is quite sad. So, comparing this to some of the stories we've heard in readings, it absolutely is very similar. Specifically in Malloy's text, we learned that schools were sites of struggle against poverty, and they operated on tight budgets. Often these budgets were far too little. On the note of Velma's sister, she tells a story in the interview of how her sister was a cook in the residential school that she attended, and she was forced against her will and to feed the young kids spoiled meat. She felt horrible about this. She knew that they were going to get sick, but she had to do it anyways. And she witnessed a lot of these children getting sick and not being well. And the weight of that kind of stuck with her. Discipline, regimentation, and punishment were children's lives. They were their reality. And this is very true for Velma, and it's very true for a lot of other people. Students were expected to maintain the operation of the school, so this ties into the budget. And as previously mentioned, Velma was given chores or jobs that she was expected to carry out every day, just like many other kids. And unfortunately, abuse was a normalized action in these institutions. Even sadder, Indigenous testimonies years later about the abuse they endured was often not trusted and was discredited. Velma speaks about this when she tells us that her brother molested her when she was 8 years old. She was later spoken to by lawyers, and they ultimately didn't believe her story, which is extremely heartbreaking. The treatment. So Velma started to go into treatment 6 years from this interview. She Ultimately, the turning point for her to do that was her son's unexpected death. He was in a car accident, and this particular son was her only child that stayed in contact with her and cared about her. So she calls this experience an awakening moment. Once Velma conquered the suicidal thoughts that came about from this and the temptation to start drinking again, she began to turn her life around. So Velma attended therapy and went to Indigenous healing centers. While doing this, Velma learned that she could take her life into her own hands and start to make some changes. While she was attending these healing centers, she learned that if she were to go through with taking her own life, she would not see her son in the afterlife. Therefore, she made a commitment to try and mend the broken relationships that she still has with her living children and grandchildren. So unfortunately, broken families is a sad reality as an outcome of residential school for many Indigenous families. I forgot to mention the sexual abuse Velma experienced while at Cooper Island with a particular priest. She tells in her interview that this particular priest used to take a group of young girls into farming fields on Sundays after Mass, and he would have the young women and Velma sit on his lap, and he would stick his hand up their skirts or their dresses. And these girls were threatened with punishment if they yelled or told on the priest. So they just had to go through with it, and this also contributes to Velma's shyness, loneliness, and fear that stuck with her for her whole life. Ultimately, her defense mechanism for getting into further trouble or punishment was just simply to keep her mouth shut and go through what she had to go through. This is a sad reality for many people who attended residential school, both male and female. So why are survivor stories important, or why do we do assignments like this where we listen to survivor stories? Asking residential school survivors to share their stories can be an extremely difficult and triggering task for many. However, I believe it is our responsibility as students, educators, and Canadians/residents of Canada to remain educated about the history of residential schools in Canada and their lasting effects. The Truth and Reconciliation Committee has done tremendous work capturing survivors' stories and seeking justice for Indigenous people. When we hear survivors' stories, we better understand our collective responsibility to reconcile and extend our empathy to Indigenous communities. When survivors share their stories, it exposes the hardships and the atrocities colonization has forced Indigenous people to endure. In the same breath, it highlights Indigenous people's continued resilience. It is important that we reflect and acknowledge the impact that the residential school system has had on generations of Indigenous families. Indigenous residential schools have harmed families for generations by diminishing their Indigenous culture, language, and identities. Lastly, how has Velma's story impacted me as a teacher? This is more of a personal reflection on how the video made me feel. So listening to Velma's story, specifically when she talked about her son's accident, broke my heart. Velma expressed true courage as she discussed some of the most difficult times of her life so that we could learn from it. I truly believe hearing Velma's story and other survivors' stories are a privilege. As a future social studies teacher, I want to be very intentional, honest, and authentic in the way that I teach students about residential schools. The history of the residential school system can be very emotional for many people, especially for those who have dealt or are currently dealing with intergenerational trauma. Knowing this and knowing the history allows teachers to better understand their Indigenous students. And I specifically want to mention that I will preach the resilience side of residential schools and that Indigenous people have survived and they're an incredibly resilient group of people, that their culture and their language has existed despite all of that they've been through. And I don't want to encourage students to pity them. I plan on replicating this assignment with my students because I believe storytelling in general is an extremely powerful tool. For me personally, I have someone in my life who went through the 60s scoop, and it's something that I never really learned about in my formal education experience. I mostly learned everything that I do know about the 60s scoop from them telling me their story. Um, so I have an incredible respect for the art of storytelling, and I definitely want to bring it into my classroom because I know and I've experienced the profound effect of it on myself, and I would like my students to have that connection as well, and not only just be reading about this in textbooks or from my PowerPoint slides, but to hear it from living, experienced people.